Hi, this is Curt and welcome to another edition of Fire Law. I have with me a special guest. It's Assistant Chief Nicol Juratovac from the San Francisco Fire Department. Nicole's been a friend for, I don't know, a number of years. She feeds me a steady stream of questions, which is really good because it challenges my thinking. And when I get, difficult advanced questions, on disciplinary issues, usually, it's good for me. I enjoy it. One of the problems is we get so many of them, and I end up spending so much time devoting to the questions that I said, you know what, rather than just, spend an hour or two responding to an email, because I know it may not seem like I spend that much time answering questions, but I do. I very often do. Let's do a podcast and let's cover the same questions, and we'll be able to sort of share the the sort of the intellectual capacity between the two of us, with the rest of the fire service. Now, a little bit on Nicole. She's, besides being an assistant chief in San Francisco, obviously a Metro Fire Department. She's an EFO grad like me, a 4-year EFO grad. Congratulations. Okay, she's got a fire science degree like I do. You got a degree in what was your undergraduate degree? Also in English and minor Asian studies, in Asian American studies. Awesome. And but my favorite, she's got her law degree. And so and when another lawyer asks you questions, that's, first of all, you got to be on your, you got to be on it when you give the answer. So that's number one. So whenever I'm replying to Nicole, I got to go, I got to make sure that I get it right. But the question is coming from a really, I think, important place, and I recognize that as well. So with that, I've been blabbing enough. So Nicole, welcome. And let's we're going to do it'll be a vlog, but hopefully it'll also be on the blog as the podcast as well.
All right.
So.
Well, thank you, Chief. I'm honored and humbled to be on your show. I want to tell everyone out there how grateful I am to be able to access your brilliant mind. And I say that in all seriousness and in all humility. You are the last of the Mohicans, as I say, because you're accessible, you're a gentleman, you're professional, and there aren't too many firefighters who have risen up through the ranks who are also of a legal mind. Who knew that when we got our law degrees, we would be using it every day in the fire service, which to our brains, because we think like lawyers, we see everything as a legal, what we call IRAC, issue, rule, analysis, conclusion. So you're much appreciated. And I know that you spend a lot of time answering some of my dumb questions, but believe me,
they're not dumb questions. They're not dumb questions at all.
well, trust me, Chief, your impact is great. And at the end of the day, people like you and I want to help others and help them navigate through what can be a very complicated system. So thank you.
Right. Well, I want to get you in a position where when you retire, you can get the law degree out there and make yourself some real money. So
I'll just be happy to retire healthy and safe.
there you go. There you go. Well, let's I know that there was a bunch of questions that you had sort of had in queue for me, and I think it'd be helpful. And I think while I may have some of the answers, I think you have some of the answers as well. And just so everyone knows, California is one of a handful of states that has a firefighter Bill of Rights. And I'm not an expert in the California Bill of Rights. Because of the teaching that I do, I have to become proficient in it. But it's not an area that I have a great deal of expertise in. And it is one that you have to live with virtually every single day when, as a chief and as an officer in a California fire department. So, but, go ahead. Let's start with, hit me with an easy one.
Okay. Softball. And softball for the most part, I've played and it's the underhand version. Okay. Slow pitch. Okay.
There we go. There we go.
So, and let me just preface this by saying that although I worked for San Francisco 23 years, the views and opinions that I project in this vlog are those of my own and not of the SFFD. So let's just get that out of the way. And one of the blessings that I've had to travel across the country to go to get educated through the National Fire Academy and FDIC, which is where I met you originally, is that I get to tap into resources like yourself, and also hearing of case studies that obviously bring about some of these questions. So the first one I have, Chief, is, have you ever seen the fire department sort of weaponize their disciplinary investigative process against an individual, or say a group of individuals that appear to be disparate in numbers and sometimes completely, grossly, and obviously unfair, where a firefighter Smith, for the sake of argument, tends to get hit a lot more than, say, others, and yet firefighter Smith is your typical hardworking, maybe a little bit outspoken, like some firefighters can be?
Yeah, and I think that is sort of the default that most fire departments find themselves in. And let's face it, by the time you get to the point where you're a chief officer, and in particular, you start moving into the front office, you're proficient at your job in terms of putting out fires, dealing with emergencies, tech rescue, and all of that stuff. But we've had virtually no training in the administrative part of things. Maybe we've seen some people, I know the departments I come from, if you're hurt, you end up at headquarters. But if you go through a career where you haven't had a lot of injuries, you may not have ever spent a day at headquarters working on anything that would be considered administrative.
Mm-hmm.
So we have people moving in the front offices that maybe they watched how other people handled a discipline matter, for good or bad. Maybe they saw somebody say, boy, I didn't like the way that person handled it. Or maybe they watched how someone else handled it. And they pretty much are just going based on what they observed, and maybe they picked up a book or two on it, but they haven't really been trained in how to enforce discipline, and what discipline should be. There's also, I think, a lack of conscious awareness of our own biases, and this is, I think, a societal issue. But there's a lack of appreciation for the role that implicit bias and confirmation bias play in both recognizing misconduct and then taking action on perceived misconduct. And I guess I'm pussyfooting around something here, but when I use a metaphor in my classes of the index card, and it was actually taught to me. I was in the instructional or educational methodology class. I forget if it was educational instructional methodology, but back in the early 90s, back at the National Fire Academy, I feel like it's one of my homes, and I really have good memories. Good memories there, the NFPA, but also U.S. Fire Administration. But in that class, we learned the index card exercise, and it's a pretty simple exercise. I teach it in a lot of my classes, but essentially, you take an index card, and on one side of the index card it has lines, on the other side it's blank. And on the top of the index card, you write the initials of the firefighter whose respect means more to you than anyone else. Could be somebody early in your career, could be somebody that you work with today, could be somebody who's already passed on, could be somebody in a different department, but somebody who you have the most respect for. You put their initials on the top of your index card. Then you flip the index card over, and you write the initials of the biggest zero in the fire service. Could be somebody who's already been fired, could be somebody that you think ought to be fired, but someone who you have no respect for them. You believe they should not be in the fire service. Okay. And the way that the exercise was taught to me is that as an officer, you should have that index card in and I'm dating myself now, but you should have that index card in your pocket every day that you go to work. Either literally or figuratively, at least have the two sets of initials in your mind. Because when you have to make a decision, if you're not consciously doing it, you're going to treat the people on the bottom of your index card differently than you treat the people on the top of your index card. Okay. Mm-hmm. So we have these folks who've come through our fire departments. They've been good firefighters, they've been good engineers, they've been good lieutenants and captains. Now they find themselves higher up. And it comes time to do discipline, and they're not aware of their index card. And they're going to be making decisions about, I've got to make a stand here. I've got to punish this person. They came in 3 minutes late. Well, what happens when somebody on the top of your index card comes in 3 minutes late? What happens when somebody on the bottom of your index card comes in 3 minutes late? Or whatever it may be, abusing the sick leave, being out of uniform, mouthing off when you shouldn't be mouthing off, all the stuff that happens in the firehouse.
Mhm.
So if we're not intellectually honest and almost enlightened about our own biases, that kind of stuff can pass right by us. And as a result, what I see it in my law practice. I see it on both sides because I represent chiefs who want to discipline people. And I know when I get that phone call from that chief, so-and-so did such and such, and I need to fire him. And I ask him, well, how's the investigation going? Oh, that's why I'm calling you. We need to start the investigation.
Mhm.
He's already decided without an investigation that the person needs to be fired just based on the allegation. So I represent chiefs, I hear that. I also represent and defend firefighters. And I see a good firefighter, somebody who spent their entire career doing the right thing,
Mhm.
and now they're under somebody's thumb. And I got to believe they're on the bottom of that chief's or whomever's index card. And they're being punished because of either an implicit bias or a confirmation bias that this particular person has. And to hell with a formal discipline process. We're just going to get this guy. And I'm actually working with some people now that are in this situation, and it's tragic.
Mhm.
And it leads to bigger problems. Certainly it can lead there, the metaphor of the index card can incorporate a lot of different biases. It can include race. It can include gender. It can include all sorts of, every possible protected class could find itself in there. But also it could be just somebody we don't like.
Mhm. Mhm.
And what they actually did becomes secondary to what that sense they're on the bottom of our index card and we feel like we have to get them. And when we have unenlightened people in the front office, and I'm not saying they're weaponizing their discipline process, but it sure as heck looks like they are
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
the observer looking from the outside in. It looks like that chief is going after the people that he or she doesn't like, and ignoring, this is the other side, ignoring the same behavior by the people he or she does like.
Sure. Sure.
And so there's a lot to it. What you just put your finger, obviously I feel passionate about this issue, and but I think it's a big problem. And I would say most fire departments find themselves, there's a few out there that don't. There's a few that really take discipline seriously, and they take the index card and implicit bias and confirmation bias seriously, and they make sure that they do a good and fair investigation to avoid the potential for this. But if you're not looking for this, and somebody finds a way into the front office and they're not enlightened as far as this goes, it's almost inevitable that they're going to either weaponize it or at least appear to be weaponizing their discipline process. Absolutely. That was kind of a long.
Bravo, bravo. You really hit a bunch of things on the head, Chief. And I think it really comes down to leadership. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. And thank God for
My
places.
son just said that.
Oh, okay.
My
Well,
son, my son, he's a chief surgeon, and anyway, he was just
oh,
he said the same thing. I said, "Whoa, I never heard of that before." And now the next day, you're saying it.
hey, Chief,
So
great minds think alike.
I guess.
But what we learned at the National Fire Academy is if you just look at leadership with the executive development program, executive leadership, the number one common denominator of leadership is that they care about people. And when you look at the behaviors of some of these administrations that will go after a particular firefighter or firefighters, your affecting their career, you're affecting their home life, their marriage, their family life. The investigations that are launched upon them, it's kind of like getting sued, but you didn't do anything. You still have to respond. You still have to go to the hearing. You still have to get a lawyer, and it's incredibly time consuming. It's incredibly stressful. And we all know that there's a statute of limitations of a year. That's a long time.
Well,
You
that's
know,
in California. That's in
correct.
California, and there's places, you're actually better off with the 1 year. I think one year is kind of long, but I think that's good. There's places out there where people, fire departments want to go back 2 years, 5 years, 10 years.
Nightmare, nightmare.
I
And
know.
I don't wish
I
that
know.
upon my worst enemy. And
Yeah.
and if it all plays out like you mentioned the word tragic, it does play out like a Shakespearean tragedy if you think about it. He talks about the universal feelings of love, hate, jealousy, and you wonder what is the driving force here? What did this firefighter do wrong? Which is kind of like the wrong question, because if you have all these disciplinary investigations dismissed and they keep hammering the poor guy
He's
until
on the bottom of somebody's index card.
right,
I can tell you that from 1,000 miles away.
right, and the poor guy is saying, or gal is saying, I'm not perfect. I'm gonna slip up because nobody is perfect. But guess what, Chief? Neither are they. So they're not so good, and he's not so bad. And I think it's really important that we, you say unenlightened. I think that's a great euphemism. I think there is a lack of training. And I think that when you're in that position, there's a lot of power, there's a lot of control. And I
And
hate to
responsibility, and I'm gonna tell you, it's tough to be in those positions. It's
correct,
it's a it's
correct.
a nobody knows the pressure that a fire chief is under, and it's a tough job. But when you don't know what you're doing, I used to joke. I said, I could go work at Amco Transmissions, and
Mhm.
I could work as hard as I possibly could on fixing people's transmissions, and all I do is turn out a bunch of broken transmissions that are not going to last very long because I don't know what I'm doing.
Right, right.
Yeah, and it's the same thing. If you're going to be a fire chief, there's a skill set.
Sure.
And it's not just ego. It's more than ego. There's plenty of chiefs that have ego,
Correct.
um, but when you couple ego with sort of lack of skills,
Right.
and I think that's why we see this problem that kind of comes across as heavy-handed use of the disciplinary process, really weaponizing the discipline
Sure.
process.
And when you mentioned that the same offense, two firefighters involved, the one firefighter gets a, hey, don't ever do that again. The other firefighter gets whatever, 8 day suspension. And with this former firefighter, you always hear, yeah, but he's a good guy. Yeah, but he spent all that time at engine company number 1 where he ran 30 calls a shift. Well, no, they both committed the same offense. They both don't have any priors. Why does this guy get off and this guy gets disciplined?
And it's hard. It's
Right.
hard. I'll give you the metaphor that I use for attorneys. Okay. So you and I, we have a law firm. Let's say we go into law practice together. Okay. And we have a law firm. Okay. And we hire 2 new associates, and we're going to give them $75,000 a year. Okay. One's a man, one's a woman. Okay. And they're both first year lawyers. And the male is bringing in about $500,000 worth of billable hours in a given year, and the female is bringing in about 25,000, and we're paying her 75, but the female is bringing in 25. Okay, and the female comes to us and says, the male is sexually harassing me. What are we going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Well, now we got a problem. Flip it around. Okay, she's bringing in $500,000 a year, and he's bringing in 25,000. Is it pretty clear what we're going to do?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, and I use that because attorneys get it. You know what I mean? Where you have somebody, but the same issue comes up in firehouses where we have, let's say, a female who's maybe not a strong firefighter, and we have somebody who is he's a terrific firefighter. He teaches at the fire academy, all these skills on the USAR team, all this stuff, and subtly, without really people realizing it, we're making value judgments.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about what actually happened. It's a value judgment about the value of the person to the group.
Absolutely.
You know, and that's another challenge that we've got to kind of separate those those implicit, those unconscious value judgments that get made, and kind of look at what's the allegation, and what did they actually, you know, what actually happened.
Sure. And, you know, you mentioned earlier, egos eat brains, or Brunacini, or one of those.
Well,
It's so true. And not to just really pump up the National Fire Academy, but that is verifiable training available to all. And I hate to say it, but many of these folks that end up in these fire chief, deputy chief positions, they barely graduated from high school. Not to knock them, because they're wonderful people, but it is a mathematical impossibility to be thrown in that administrative position and to expect this individual, who may have been a great field chief, who can take down the Taj Mahal that's on fire and break that down and fight that. But when it comes to people's careers, people's lives, and what I've noticed is the disciplinary investigations sometimes get amped up almost in a witch hunt when the individual happens to be close for promotional exams. So, gosh, you think about the timeliness of it. Is it coincidental? Is it by design? Is it completely, not coincidental? So you mentioned the implicit bias. I'm so glad that that's part and parcel of our training now. I think it's an eye-opener. They do make it mandatory for supervisors, which is good. And we also have, at those administrative positions, a beeline to our attorney who is assigned to the fire department. But let's keep this clear. The attorney doesn't run the fire department. The fire chief still runs the fire department.
You don't want attorneys running the fire department.
Thank you.
You know, you do not want attorneys with, you know, I come from a family of attorneys, and, you know, attorneys tend to be afraid of their own shadow, you know, and that they've got to, like, I was listening to a continuing legal ed class, and they had to give a big presentation at the beginning that this is not legal advice. And I'm like, it's a continuing legal ed class. Why are you saying it's not legal advice? Your attorney talking to other attorneys, you know, and it's that paranoia that lawyers have. And when you let that kind of paranoia in an organization like a fire department, you won't be able to do anything. But anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So just to kind of wrap it up, when these things get to the point where it's clear that it is being weaponized, how do you feel about the particular firefighter making sure that he or she documents everything in the event it goes into that zone of retaliation or harassment? I know that with retaliation, there are 3 elements to it: the protected activity, the timeliness, and the actual adverse action. Well, I've learned through a lot of these case studies, and thanks to you for directing me in the right path, that even the number of disciplinary investigations weaponized or launched against a particular individual can be seen and satisfy that 3rd element of adverse action. Although that person hasn't been given the actual discipline of the suspension or the letter of reprimand or anything like that, the sheer fact that there have been a number of disciplinary investigations launched on that individual, the courts have ruled that if a reasonably prudent person is dissuaded from filing a complaint because he sees what's happening, that satisfies retaliation. What are your thoughts about that, Chief?
Yeah, you know, retaliation is the plaintiff's attorney's friend, and they'll try to create, and I call it tee up, the metaphor I use is, but they're trying to tee up, put the ball on the tee to drive it down the fairway, tee up a retaliation claim, and it's relatively easy to do. But in terms of a firefighter who finds themselves in that situation, it's a challenge. And I don't think there's an easy solution to it. And, you know, I kind of talk about things as being either a sea-level problem or a 50,000 foot problem, you know, and when that firefighter's in that moment is being, you know, written up, but when that doesn't work, they write them up again, and that doesn't work, they write them up again, it's very difficult to deal with that. And I'll kind of come back to that as a second. And I think the better way to approach that is to get the organization at the 50,000 foot view to recognize that, because there's a lot of dysfunction. What that C-level problem, there's a lot of dysfunction. And there's nothing good for the organization that will come out of it if that continues.
Yeah.
So if we can change it at the 50,000-foot view mark and recognize that there's a better way to handle these types of things, a better approach, a more enlightened approach, that's really where we should go. And then that solves the C-level problem. But in terms of when you're in there, and I've been involved in these, and one of the differences with me in particular, being an attorney and a firefighter, is when I go in, I'm going for the fire chief's jugular. When I'm representing a firefighter, I'm going for, and that's what we have to do. I mean, it's called zealous representation, and I'm going. And what I leave in my path could be very ugly. And that is the C-level problem, and that is not good for the organization. But that's my obligation. When I'm defending a firefighter, it's scorched earth. And what I find is sometimes that brings me into conflict with the union, because the union then has to live with the aftermath of the scorched earth tactic that I take. Now, if I save somebody's job, I really, that's not my problem. My problem is this person's going to get terminated, and, we're going to war. And I mean literal war. We'll do whatever we got to do to win. That's not healthy in terms of coming up with the 50,000-foot solution. So I'd much rather stay at that level. I don't like the hand-to-hand combat. I'll do it. I can't say I don't like it, but there's that intellectual challenge of that hand-to-hand combat that happens, in disciplinary hearings and arbitrations and civil service and so on. But I'd much rather fix that problem at the 50,000-foot view mark.
Well, it reminds me of one of the best things I ever heard from an old retired battalion chief. The best way to fight a fire is to kick its ass, right?
Yeah.
You want to pounce, dominate, Tora. It's kind of like what General Colin Powell said. In order to defeat the enemy, you have to dominate it with so much force that he has no chance.
He wants to give up.
Yeah,
he wants to give up.
I like the bazooka. I don't like the little pistol. But I love it. Forget the hand-to-hand combat. That's for practice. But when it comes to the real deal, I like the scorched earth analogy. That's great.
Well, it's unfortunate, and again, I'm surprised sometimes, but I get it that the unions are like, well, we don't want to take that tact, and I'm like, you want your guy to get fired? Really? But they're saying, well, we got to live with this afterwards. So, all right, that's,
And Chief, and that's the reality of our line of work. We have the union, we have management, labor management, and it can get very political. And what I've noticed is a lot of the firefighters, depending on what's at stake with their disciplinary investigation, they will either spend the money and get a lawyer independent of the union, or they will rely on union representation. I am a member of the union. I have been all my career. Not to say that their representation won't be as zealous, but I think that firefighters are realizing that they could end up being a political pawn, and they want to remove themselves from any of that equation, depending on what they have at stake. If there's not a promotional exam in the next 5 years, they might just take that chance and go on the lower cost end and get the union representation, which sometimes can be good, sometimes leaves a little bit to be desired. So, so the other thing I wanted to mention, Chief, that I know a lot of firefighters are getting more empowered with utilizing the Public Records Act. They're requesting documents from there to be able to compare and contrast, for example, an AWOL situation or the 8 minutes late.
Sure.
Why did this guy get nothing and I'm looking at, 2 days off type of thing. So
why does that happen?
No comment, but we're here for a reason, right? Like I said, my opinions are my own, not those that represent the fire department.
No, it does. It happens all the time. So.
Right, all the time. And I really like when you said in the beginning, why are we here? We're here to help those that we have seen probably bullied or probably in a situation where it was clearly unfair. And I believe the man upstairs have given us the skills and the knowledge to not only keep it to ourselves, but to actually give back and to help in the fire service. And I really love the quote in the Bible, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And these guys in positions of power have to, check their biases at the door, their vindictive nature, their retaliatory feelings, and really lead in the most unbiased way that they're capable of. And that's why they're getting paid the big bucks. They can't allow their personal feelings to get in the way. But going back to what I was saying, I think it's important for firefighters to gather the data. The data doesn't lie. And these are public records information that are available. I know that the names get redacted, of course, but you don't need the names when you have the actual wrongdoing and then the actual discipline. In California, sure, we have a law that says that you can get anything within the Public Records Act that has been adjudicated. So anything that's pending, or let's say you, Chief, were investigated in California. If there was no discipline that resulted, none of that information is available. But if you were disciplined, then it is available to the public by virtue of you being a public safety officer. So yeah, that is available to folks.
Yeah, and there's another aspect to that. I don't know if you're going to go there, but due process. There's an element. There's 7 essential components of due process, mm-hmm, and part of due process, one of those 7 elements, is the right to discovery. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I don't know if you recall from law school the Matthews v. Eldridge balancing test about due process, but under Matthews v. Eldridge, your right to due process, or how much the employer has to provide in terms of due process when you're being terminated, is much greater than when you're just being reprimanded. So you may not have a right to discovery when you're just being reprimanded, or maybe a 1-day suspension. Mm-hmm. But when you're looking at termination or something of a serious nature, you not only have the public records right to access that, but you have a right to discovery. And part of that right to discovery is knowing what other people have received in terms of a penalty for similar infractions. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's another, you got sort of a 2-pronged argument there.
Yeah, very good. Well, Chief, I'd like to move on to a second topic, if you don't mind.
Okay, let's see. We've been going here for about we'll give it another 10 minutes or so, and so yes, absolutely, we got time.
These are even more softballs. Okay, this.
Well, I'm enjoying this, and you know what? Maybe we'll do another one. Fairly soon. That's good. But go ahead. So I got to tell you, I'm a baseball player. I played some softball, but the big arc, I could never hit the big arc. It's just I don't know what it was.
I know.
I don't know if you were fast pitch, but
you get through the pop-ups the first couple months, and then you're hitting it out of the park. So double jeopardy. I have seen travel across the country, mm-hmm, firefighters getting, say, a slap on the wrist. Like, let's say they do a wrongdoing. Let's say they wear the wrong T-shirt or wrong uniform shirt. Hey, don't ever do that again. But then 2 months later, they get that ominous mail at home saying that you are now under investigation. Maybe the example was poor, but you get what I'm saying. And I think you taught me the employer only gets one bite at the apple. Do they not know that? Is it sort of like this benign neglect, or and the facts are no other additional facts came about. The wrongdoing is a wrongdoing for which he was told don't do it again, and then 2 months later he gets hit with the disciplinary investigation. Thoughts on that?
Sure. Chief? Well, the principle of double jeopardy is a criminal principle, and it's embodied in our Constitution. But the fact that it's in the Constitution means that as a human race, we had learned this lesson before, that it's not fair to keep going after somebody time and time again when they've done something wrong, and you can't prove it. So you've got one bite at the apple on the criminal side, and that's so important that it's in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to discipline is not a crime. So we're not dealing with a constitutional issue, but there's the civil equivalent. I don't know if you remember from civil procedure and some of the other classes evidence, but res judicata and collateral estoppel. They're 2 legal principles that apply generally. They will apply criminally to some extent, but they're really civil. They just, double jeopardy is so important that there's really no need for them in other things. But res judicata essentially means that the matter has been decided,
Mhm.
and we're not going to decide it again. You know,
Mhm.
the matter's been decided. Collateral estoppel is a little bit different. It's an equitable principle, but essentially it means that the because of the equities about what's happened, the court is going to stop whomever, usually the employer, but going to stop the employer from either disciplining the person or, you know, continuing the process.
Mhm.
So those two principles sort of embody what's been called industrial double jeopardy, the principle of industrial double jeopardy.
Mhm.
And when we think about, and I tend to use the term adjudication for, and I believe that that's the proper. I had an attorney in Florida take issue with you know, my characterization of discipline as an adjudication, but I believe that that is the proper term for the discipline decision. And the discipline decision is two things. It's, you know, guilty or not guilty, and that's it's really the charges are sustained or not sustained, but guilty or not guilty. And then the other side of it is, what's the appropriate penalty?
Mhm.
So both of those combine to make the adjudication decision.
Mhm.
Okay, so guilty, not guilty. If guilty, what's the appropriate penalty is the adjudication decision. Once that's been made, to go back and revisit it again, the defenses would either be res judicata or collateral estoppel or both,
Very
which
good.
is essentially industrial, you know, the sort of the labor, the employment attorney, labor attorney part of me would call it industrial double jeopardy.
Mhm. I think you're right because again, it goes to a lot of these cases where they eventually got the slap on the hand, but what I'm hearing is someone in the chain, higher in the chain, didn't like the fact that he just got a slap on the wrist, so
Yeah.
they double down and they hit him with a discipline investigation, hoping to get something more. And I don't want to get off topic, Chief, but a lot of these disciplinary investigations are launched under the generic term of misconduct
Mhm.
instead of a specific allegation, so
Mhm.
that if something does come up in the investigation, they can sort of chase the rabbit, if you will. And that's not in
Yeah.
good faith. That is, again, sort of just cause and or a due process, if you will. And
Right.
all of these cases point to the fire chief, the
Mhm.
leadership. And, you know, in EFO, I think you learn doing things right is one way, which is checkbox, benchmark, versus doing the right thing. What is the
Mhm.
right thing here? And then that takes a fire chief with who's evolved, who is enlightened. And I think if you look at a lot of these fire chief brochures for the job of fire chief, what I'm seeing in the language is you must be approachable. You must be a bridge builder. You must work well with all groups.
Mhm.
So we need that fire chief. I think we're seeing through the years that gone are the days when you're that authoritarian, my way or the highway. I think
Mhm.
people are more sophisticated where it's not a one size fits all type of disciplinary system.
That's the theory. That's the theory, Nicole. But I'll tell you, there's an awful lot of cities out there where the mayor wants the fire chief to be willing to stand in front of a gun and take the bullet for the mayor.
Mhm.
And as long as loyalty to the mayor or loyalty to the administration is the most important criteria, you're not going to have consideration of a lot of those other uh, concerns. So, you know, we have the ideal, we have the theory, and then, you know, we have sort of what we're stuck with.
Mhm. Mhm.
And but but yeah, and you know, now I do want to clarify. There's a lot of factual questions about whether or not it's the same offense,
Mhm.
you know, in that double jeopardy issue. So it's possible you could, you know, when you actually get into the facts of it, that let's say a firefighter is accused of doing A, you know,
Mhm.
whatever A is. So firefighter is accused of A, and so we discipline the firefighter for doing A. And then after the firefighter's discipline, we realize, oh, wait a minute, he didn't not only did A, but he did B and C as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, again, double jeopardy, there's elements, and we have to get into the elements of a crime. But with double jeopardy, there has to be a commonality of all of the elements in order for double jeopardy. So, if we have a factual situation where, let's say, a firefighter was, let's say, I don't know, he was insubordinate to his lieutenant. Okay. And so we discipline him that way. And then we find that not only was he insubordinate to the lieutenant, but he also, when he had a conversation with the chief, was insubordinate to the chief, and then, did several other things. Well, now it's not, yes, it did evolve out of that first thing, but there's more factually involved here. So you really have to be careful that we're speaking apples to apples and not apples to oranges in terms of that industrial double jeopardy.
Exactly. And I think, Chief, it also goes toward when did the department have knowledge of that particular offense or potential rule violation? They may have had the knowledge about violation regarding A, but they're just now learning about violation regarding B, and for which they need to start the wheels of disciplinary investigation process going.
Yeah,
so
and let me throw this out as well, that when the firefighter involved is on the bottom of someone's index card and the person is upset that the firefighter got away with whatever it is, they're going to be looking for excuses to say, well, we're not looking into A. We're going to let A stay. We think he did B, C, and D, and we want to go after it that way. And that's when you're not intellectually honest and you have a process that can be subverted and hijacked by someone who has this agenda, then truly I think the term weaponized is the right term, that you have they're bullies. To me, people who would do that are bullies. They may not be physical bullies, but they're manipulating the process to get their desired outcome in an unfair way. And when I hate having to discipline people, you have to do it, and I kind of say, here's what I think happened. We'll do the investigation, and then you have a hearing, and whatever happens, happens. I mean, it's, I hope you don't lose your job, but here's the process, and I'm not out to get you. It's, if anybody is involved in a disciplinary process and they feel a vested interest that they have to get somebody, that somehow they have failed, if somebody isn't punished, they should not be involved in that discipline process. They're the wrong person to be involved in that process.
Well, and that's spoken from a true leader who actually cares about people, because you're right. It should be, when you're firing or when you're working toward terminating a firefighter, the worst day of your life as a fire chief. You don't want to do it. You probably looked at every other reasonable alternative. It finally had to come to this. And, I think you taught me that discipline really should be a win-win. You want this person to change his behavior. You want this person to commit to changing, assuming that what he did was a clear violation. It's almost like, the team that goes into halftime at a football game and the coach gives them the rah-rah speech, and you're down by 20 points and you're walking out of that locker room like, hey, how can we lose? Because you're going to give 1,000% for that chief, for that coach. And that's how I see the whole disciplinary process ought to be. And what I'm seeing is almost to the point of unethical. And, as a lawyer, and even through law school, we had to take a class on professional responsibility, where our job is not to get firefighter Smith or firefighter Jones. Our job is to ensure that the process is fair, that he is afforded his due process rights. And when I see almost a prosecutorial misconduct at play here, that's when my moral compass and my intuition just says, something's not right about this. And as firefighters, having gone into burning buildings, having cut holes on the roof, you want to rely on this guy or gal that's next to you for your life. And we're going to mess up, but it doesn't mean that he's now, excuse my language, but shit on a shingle and he deserves to be fired. You know what I mean? They're actually good characteristics and attributes, and we want him for the long run, is my point.
And it's self-defeating when we do that. Okay, it's self-defeating because, and again, I don't want to name names, but let's say we have a firefighter who has a medical condition that's not work-related, and they are basically, they're going to run out of sick leave, and they've got family, they got little kids and stuff like that. We know what the fire service family will do in that situation. They'll work for the person. They'll substitute for the person. They'll take the person to the doctor if they can't get a ride. They'll take the person's children to their doctor's appointments, to school and all that. That's the brotherhood. And so what you're talking about when it comes to discipline is someone who is maybe the recipient, or the person, the person who was sick at the time now becomes a chief, and then has to make decisions about the people who were volunteering to help their family. And if we expect us to have discipline on both sides of that index card, we have to have a fair process. And when the process is looked at with suspicion, and it's viewed as being a weapon of an uncaring boss, they're not going to use the process. And that's a problem. And that's why I say there's a 50,000 foot view challenge that we've got. We can fight it out. I'll kick them and drag them and scratch them as much as I can in those sea level battles. And I will walk away from that hearing bloodied and whatever has to happen. But that's not where we want to fix this problem. We want to fix this problem and there's no amount of those sea level battles that's going to fix this problem. It's got to be fixed at the 50,000 foot view, you know, to really have some meaningful result.
Right. And Chief, when I worked for a great chief, old school chief back in the 90s, I remember he would just bring a firefighter or lieutenant in the chief's office, no paperwork, and that individual would come in headquarters, clean shaven, boots shine, class A. He'd be in there in the fire chief's office for about 20 minutes, and as he was walking out, he'd be like, "Whew, I never want to come back here again." And that was it. It was done with. But now things have changed 20 plus years later. There's more paperwork, there's more CYA, there's more, you know, legal things.
And we've got to be more sophisticated. We've got to be more sophisticated.
Yeah.
You know, that's really what we're getting at.
And not forget to be human during that whole sophistication process. So
yeah, and understand we're going to be villainized because, you know, when you're in the front office, you're going to be villainized. It goes with the turf, and you know, you can try to be everybody's buddy, but that is not the solution either. You know, but we've got to find a way to do it. So, but listen, we've been going now for almost an hour here, 50 minutes or so. So let's wrap up. And what we'll do is, I enjoyed it. You know, maybe we can do it again in a couple of weeks, and we'll address some additional issues. I don't know if you have anything that you wanna wrap up with.
No, Chief, I just want to say thank you, and I hope the audience out there picked up a nugget or two. And I just know that you have a good heart, and you really want to empower people. And really, knowledge is power, and we are in a position to convey that information to folks. And I hope that it just made things a little bit more enlightening for all those folks out there. So thank you.
Well, and I, you know what, I want to just thank you again and say I really think that this will help firefighters as opposed to you and I just emailing back and forth. I think it's a much better way for folks to sort of maybe have a little window into what two firefighter legal minds you know, might have to say on a certain issue. So okay, and until next time, until next time, that'll be it for fire law.
All right, thank you, Chief.